This week on To the Contrary.
First, an historic summit at the Vatican takes on sexual abuse by priests. Then, how racism impacted black suffragists fighting for women's voting rights. Behind the headlines, the historical importance of Black History Month from two women who know.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Orbey. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the Pope takes on sex abuse.
Hear the cry of the little ones asking for justice. That's what Pope Francis urged high-ranking officials to do as he opened an historic summit addressing sexual abuse scandals plaguing the Catholic Church. Almost 200 church officials from more than 100 nations are at the 4-day conference to discuss their responsibilities when dealing with abuse allegations. Last week, the Pope defrocked former U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick after he was found guilty of abuse by the Vatican. Experts say McCarrick's case shows the Vatican's willingness to hold powerful archbishops accountable. But that comes after decades of church officials downplaying or outright denying the problem. Last year, the Pope himself came under intense criticism for defending a Chilean bishop widely suspected of covering up another bishop's abuse. Survivors and advocates are urging the Pope to establish a zero-tolerance policy for abusive priests and those who cover for them.
So, Congresswoman Norton, is the Church and the Pope, are they finally on the right track?
Bonnie, the Church is finally compelled to act now that law enforcement authorities, like those in Pennsylvania, are moving aggressively.
Yeah, I think this is a better step than we've seen in the past. After Boston, 20 years ago, we saw nothing come of it, so hopefully this is something better.
This is a crisis of faith, and I hate to say it, but anything short of zero tolerance is too little too late.
We're bankrupt in terms of morality here, and I think that people don't want to see Caesar judging Caesar at the end of it.
Well, but Patrice mentioned, Megan, and you grew up in the church, that Boston 20 years ago, actually the scandals broke in Australia 30 years ago and hit the U.S. 2 decades ago. And I know that's like a split second in the history of the Catholic Church, which took 500 years to exonerate the Galileo for saying that the Earth wasn't right.
That whole gravity thing.
Right, exactly. So anyway, but will this, is it just going to be chipping away incrementally?
Things move a lot faster in today's society, and I think people just feel that this is so long overdue, and it is very, it echoes what we've seen in other patriarchal hierarchies where there's a circling of the wagons. We've seen it with the military and sexual assault. We've seen it with law enforcement on, police abuses. And I think enough is enough, and we have to rebuild the trust that people have in their institutions, and of course, that would include their church.
Angela, what do you think?
I think as they are going through the summit and looking for solutions, there's got to be transparency, there's got to be accountability in order for people to be able to regain trust in the institution. And we've seen the Pew Research data that says that Catholics are losing confidence.
And are they losing membership? Is there global membership going down?
They're losing membership in some countries, gaining
in developed countries. They're gone in Europe pretty much, right?
But that was happening anyway, and this only accelerates it. It's very important for us to distinguish between wrongdoing under civil authorities and wrongdoing under the church. And I'm trying to understand it. Theirs is a different matrix. Even involving children, I'm sure that the priests and overseers that have been involved have said they will be forgiven, we will send them to another place. And it's at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness, even for terrible sins like murder and the worst sins
Right,
in the
but
world.
what about the victims?
Wait a minute, I'm trying to
Okay,
speak
go ahead.
from Catholic theology now. Of course, what about the victims?
Yeah.
But I'm saying, well, what about the victims too if the church opposes capital punishment? So, what about the victims? The church is always thinking of both the victim and I'm not even a Catholic here, I'm explaining this thing, of both the victim and the sinner. And so I'm trying to understand how very good men like the Pope, who, by the way, has in many ways been a wonderful path-breaking a Pope, how he could not see this. And I'm trying to keep from thinking like Eleanor Holmes Norton with a law degree and think like a priest. That is hard to do.
But they did at this commission or council lay out rules that bishops have to use to when they find allegations of abuse against priests, against other higher officials.
Well, perhaps they didn't have that before, and that level of accountability didn't exist. I'm going to take this actually outside of the Catholic setting. The Christian world, lots of denominations struggle with this very same issue, whether it's, and unfortunately, because there's a lack of accountability, because independent churches, for example, have no one telling them, imposing these kinds of rules that bring some accountability, this goes undealt with. So I think this is good, and this should be a cautionary tale to every faith that you need to be careful about the leaders and be able to deal with this behavior when it happens.
I wonder, though, I am a Catholic. I had 13 years of Catholic school. If the fact that the Catholic Church is really sort of an outlier when it comes to giving women a path to leadership, if that's the reason, now maybe there are these problems in other churches and we just don't know about it, but it seems like they are singular in having such a big problem.
Well, I was going to ask about marriage. Is this going to be, the slippery slope towards allowing priests to marry?
Well, I've always thought
you
they should
mentioned,
allow it.
sexual abuse in the military. It's not like there aren't big institutions where marriage is allowed, where this kind of stuff doesn't go on. But it seems like to the extent that it went on here.
Yeah. I actually think it would be very helpful. I think it would be better for the priesthood in general. I think there would be a greater understanding of the flock if they're having similar lives. I've never understood why that would be necessary. And everybody I know in the Catholic Church said it was an economic decision. They didn't want to have to pay for all those families, which, could make some sense.
But also, it's raising a lot of the seminarians are where the older priests were going to for their sexual outlets, and it was male on male. What's this going to do to the church dealing with gay priests?
I don't know. Early on in his term, this Pope said, "Live and let live," with regard to gay relationships. And that was
didn't he say, "Who am I to?"
And who am I to judge?
Right.
And he has said some very. It may have been "Who am I to judge?" and not "Live and let live," but it was sort of the first open door, open statement made by the church, and it was really kind of amazing and hopeful. Because we like to think, if we're Christians, that you're going to embrace everyone. There will be compassion. There will be understanding. And so I think this particular Pope has actually made some movement on
Oh, but he's moving so slowly. This Pope is like a worldwide institution. So they've given us McCarrick. They could have given us many more. He's trying to make a statement by giving us a high priest from the nation's capital. But one wonders whether the church can break its very slow way to deal with everything, whether it's a problem or not.
All right, let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To The Contrary. From the future of the Catholic Church to Black History Month and a horrific, little-known aspect of first-wave suffragist history, the racism white women exhibited toward their black counterparts in the fight for women's right to vote.
Call it explicit insensitivity by people who should have known better. Call it Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other white suffragists acting as products of their own racist times. But black suffragists who fought equally hard for the women's right to vote suffered the demoralizing effect of racism from the white women running the movement. For one, black women had to form their own suffrage league, which marched at the back of parades organized to press for ratification of the 19th Amendment instead of with their state delegations, as did white suffragists. When the black suffragist and civil rights leader Mary Church Terrell petitioned her white sisters for help, they responded that the disenfranchisement of black women was a race problem, not a gender problem, and beyond the movement's writ.
When I look at the leadership of the Women's March, which is actually, at least the young women who were instated by the older women who actually started the march in the first place, but the young women are more of color than white. And then I think about this example in history. Do white feminists still owe black feminists something, whatever that may be, for the sins of their great-grandmothers?
No, no debts here. What these women were caught in is the racism of their time. Bear in mind that many of these very suffragette leaders had been leaders in the abolition movement. In fact, the first abolitionists were white women. Then, when we got as late as the 20th century, and still no movement on half the population, they took a very strategic and unprincipled position. And one wonders whether they
spell it out.
And that unprincipled position was, look, all of this desegregation that we've been for takes a back seat, and I mean literally a back seat. We waited too long, and essentially they made a strategic position surrounded by an American philosophy that said blacks were inferior anyway. We've been out here, and they've taken care of everybody but us. We're the majority, and we are claiming our rights. And in doing so, they lost the respect of the black suffragettes and showed what it takes to do two things at one time. And that's what the women thought they could not do, deal with racism and sexism at the same time.
Would they have succeeded, do you think, if they tried to do both back in the 19 teens?
I think it would have been a risk they'd had to take. And when you're in the middle of a movement and trying to move forward quickly and you're tired of waiting, they probably didn't feel like they had the time and space to try to work out all the details of that. But I tell you this, I salute the black women for having the persistence and the dedication to continue to fight not only for their rights, but their families' rights.
Yeah. You know, Jill Lepore has written a great book called These Truths, and it's about the American history through the lens of the promises of our founders. We hold these truths. And those truths are, liberty, equality, all of the things that we really were not delivering at all in a society that had racism and that didn't allow women basic rights. In the 1960s, there was a congressman who was trying to kill the Civil Rights Bill. He was a Jim Crow Democrat from Virginia. And he said, I know what I'll do. I'll put women in there. And so he put women in the bill. And the only reason the Civil Rights Bill in the 60s had covered women is because they thought it was a poison pill. And so what's interesting is there has been this tension. His name was Congressman Howard Smith. And he was in the 8th District where my husband now serves. And his son actually wrote us a letter and told us about this, and he said, he's often referred to as a great feminist for having included the women, but here's the story. And Jill Lepore has it in her book, too.
It's sad to look back at this, at kind of the strategic decisions that were made, where you're willing to accept racism just because you wanted to get women the vote so that then you can end temperance. That's what I understand the strategy being. But when we pull that to 2018, 2019, and I look at the Women's March today, I see, unfortunately, anti-Semitism among the leaders. And while we have a more diverse women's movement leadership, it's sad when you see people's prejudices still come out.
So that's anti-Semitism, one person. Don't say among the leaders.
When you go to
one
person,
there are two.
All right, so two.
It's reported that actually a number of them.
Well, she's
No,
talking
she said
out
among
of
the
five.
leaders. These people are not the leaders of this movement. In fact, this movement, you never heard the names of these people.
It's
They happen to have been the ones who stepped up. And then a whole bunch of people stepped up against it. And what happened when a new Women's March was called just a month or so ago? They said, we're not doing this nationally, we're doing this in our states so that we are not contaminated with this anti-Semitism.
Which is fantastic, Delegate Norton. I mean, I'm glad that at the state level people push back against the anti-Semitism, but I'm not going to contest that there isn't that among the leadership. And my larger point is that...
And it's 2 out of 5, let me just say, not 2 out of 100 million who protested.
But this is not like the civil rights movement where you really did have people who were nominated and became your leaders. These are 5 women that stepped up. Then this thing spread across the country, and if I were to ask you to name even one of those leaders, you probably couldn't, because nobody ever heard of them. But it's true that they started every other group of women across the country to want to do exactly what they did. So it kind of
and that's what's so great about it. It's a grassroots movement,
which is fantastic.
Exactly.
My larger point is that throughout history, prejudices in individuals will bubble up. And, we're going to, in 100 years, people will look back now at the women's movement and point that out. So hopefully we're addressing it, dealing with it, and then pushing it aside and not, looking back and being the same people we were 100 years ago in the previous women's march movement.
All right, behind the headlines. We continue our coverage of Black History Month. We interviewed 2 very prominent African-American female members of Congress, besides our Eleanor Holmes Norton, Barbara Lee, and Karen Bass, who have secured their own spots in the history books.
African American History Month is always a very positive thing, and it's important because it's an opportunity to lift up the contributions that Black Americans have made to U.S. history. I do long for the day when it's not really needed, because African Americans would be completely incorporated into U.S. history, but we haven't achieved that day yet.
Representative Bass chairs the Congressional Black Caucus. Bass believes there is no American history without Black history, and she sees it as a living history, with notables such as Stacey Abrams becoming the first African-American woman to deliver the official response to the State of the Union address. She also points to more personal sheroes.
My role models? Oh, so many people. For example, the woman that was in Congress before me, Congresswoman Diane Watson, is absolutely a role model. She is a person that recruited me to run for office the first time and also to run for her seat when she decided to retire. And I call on her right away because I think she's a wonderful example of a woman reaching back to a younger woman and saying, come on aboard. One that I always look to is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, who was an enslaved woman who devoted her life to freeing other Africans who were enslaved, and she was a soldier. And I've always appreciated her leadership, the role she played in history.
Bass made history herself as a leader, breaking barriers.
When I was in the legislature, my last term, I was elected speaker, and I remember that race, and it was very exciting. But one of the things that was the most exciting was when they did the research and found that there hadn't been an African-American woman speaker anywhere in the country. And so my election to the speakership in California was the first time an African-American woman had been elected speaker of any legislative body.
Representative Barbara Lee, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, credits her political career to a prominent African-American historic figure.
My entree into politics really was as a result of the first African-American woman elected to Congress who also ran for president, and that was Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. And she encouraged me to register to vote, first of all, and get involved in politics. And fast forward to when I was elected in 1998, I was the 20th African-American woman only since 1789 to have been elected to the House of Representatives.
Lee also sees her mother as a role model and a woman worthy of note in the history books.
My mother, my late mother, she was a phenomenal woman. She broke many glass ceilings. She was one of the first 12 students to integrate the University of Texas at El Paso. She was, I think, the first African-American woman civilian who worked at Fort Bliss. And she called Mary McLeod Bethune down to her university at one point, at Southern University, because of an issue of one woman couldn't join the sorority because of the whole color issue. And my mother said, I'm not going to join if she can't join. So Mary McLeod Bethune came down there and broke that up.
Lee believes it's critical to tell the history of African American women in the U.S.
You look at Fannie Lou Hamer and Sojourner Truth and all of Ida B. Wells and Dorothy Heights and Shirley Chisholm and all of the women who came before us. What they did just to pave the way, I mean, they struggled, and I knew many of them. And they had a hard time, but they didn't look back, and they kept going. And I think that inspiration that I get from those who came before me and the gratitude I have for them keeps me humble in one respect, because, I mean, as hard as it's been for myself, I mean, it's in no way did I experience what they experienced.
Lee says this history is empowering for young African American women. She shares it with freshman members of Congress who call her their big sister, such as Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts.
I was showing Ayanna Pressley a photo of myself and the Honorable Shirley Chisholm in the early 90s when Shirley Chisholm came out to help me in my first election for the Assembly. Well, Ayanna is so proud and happy that she has Shirley Chisholm's office. And so I had a chance to share that with Ayanna to let her know that I know what she feels and how she's feeling and the inspiration that she has received from just being in Shirley Chisholm's office.
So, Patrice, the black women you know who are involved in politics and making history, are they getting enough national attention, do you think?
I think so. I mean, my hero, one of them, is Dr. Condoleezza Rice, and everybody wants her to run for president every election cycle. And so I think the point made that, you know, we shouldn't just have 1 month dedicated to learning about our black sheroes or, you know, black heroes in general. It should be woven throughout teaching and civics and U.S. history. Unfortunately, it's not.
But isn't the purpose of Black History to get it written, the Black History Month, I mean, to remind people to use a period in time every year to remind people, and to hope one day that the Barbara Lees of the world are written in, and the Congresswoman Nortons are written into history as well they should be.
I definitely understand the need for the month, and I agree with the month. I certainly highlight people like Sarah Boone, who was an inventor in the early 1900s. She created the ironing board and a lot of household items. People don't know about these folks.
Or the women who coded.
That's right. There you go. Exactly. The women who sent the first spaceship into U.S. ship into space. So I mean, there's a lot to learn and be woven into our U.S. civics history.
I'm glad that you featured in Black History Month women. By the way, the growth in women in the Congressional Black Caucus, and both of these women have been chairs of our caucus. The growth of women among African American voters, says everything about how African Americans perceive leaders and leadership. The African Americans have always been on the forefront of understanding what women can do, and the increase in the number of women black women who represent districts is a continuation of that faith in what women can do.
Do you think conservative black women have gotten enough credit and attention in the history books?
I think more attention could be given there. I am so excited about Kay Coles James and her taking the helm at the Heritage Foundation. And her position there is, it resonates back out to all of America in terms of an image of a person who can lead, a person with, you know, a stellar background across multiple sectors, who's dynamic and who's having impact. And so, as you said, we're at a point now in history where these things are being woven in more into the daily news cycle and just the day-to-day conversation about who's doing what.
I just say we need more women. Those who write history are the winners, and we've got to win more elections.
Well, but given how long this fight, I mean, Shirley Chisholm running for president was more than 50 years ago now. How long is it going to take until her achievements are written into all the African American history books?
Right. Well, you know, there's a beautiful
Sorry, we're
portrait
out
of
of
her. Okay.
We'll
anyway.
talk about it
How long?
and
Good
credit.
question.
That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary, and whether you agree or think to the contrary. See you next week. So you were saying.
Capitol building. Sure.
Oh, that is.